Hello everyone. We already talked about 1919 Act and 1935 Act. Now we can go for a comparison between 1919 Act and 1935 Act. See, whenever we talk about 1919 Act and 1935 Act, we have to remember the context, what exactly is the context of these two acts, then only we can understand the significance, comparison, difference, right. So, the context of these two acts, these two constitutional provisions were what? Demand for responsible government, right. And as the demand for responsible government or representation grew in India, the British had been forced to introduce a series of constitutional reforms. A number of acts were passed, gradually enlarging the space for Indian participation in provincial government. The executive was made partly responsible to the provincial legislature in 1919 and almost entirely responsible, that you can say, under the Government of India Act 1935 Act. And after 1935 Act, right, you can say elections were held in 1937 under this act, you can say, and the Congress came to power in 8 out of 11 provinces. So, a form of responsible government, right, you will see that established. So, you have to remember this background of 1919 and 1935 Act, context of this 1919 and 1935 Act, then only we can compare these two acts, right. Now, when we will compare this, first important point you have to remember, right, that what exactly is the background of these two acts. See, background of 1919 Act is what? Home Rule League movement, right, and after Home Rule League movement 1916-17, if you remember, Indians were clamoring for self-government, embodying the right of self-determination, and this led to what? Demand of Swaraj. So, what is the background of 1919 Act? The demand of Swaraj, and 1919 Act, right, was not considered, you can say, satisfactory, right, in the context of this demand. Then what exactly is the background of 1935 Act? See, you have to appreciate 1935 Act in the context of 1929 Lahore resolution, Purna Swaraj resolution. So, in 1935 Act, we should analyze in the context of Purna Swaraj resolution, not only Swaraj, Purna Swaraj resolution. So, background is different, and therefore, analysis should be different, and therefore, the importance of these two acts, you can say, is also, right, you can say, different in different context. Okay. Now, when you compare, the second important idea, you should remember that 1919 Act was based on Montfort report, but 1935 Act was based on Simon Commission report and Round Table Conference report, and then white paper issued. So, 1935 Act was the result of that white paper, right. So, this is the second important point. Then third important point, you should remember that 1919 Act had separate preamble, but there was no such preamble in 1935 Act, right. Then fourth important point, you should remember that 1919 Act, right, was more centralized and unitary in nature, but 1935 Act was more decentralized in nature, right. Then fifth important point, you should remember that 1919 Act, right, never talked about federation, but 1935 Act provided for the establishment of an all India federation, right. Then fifth, you can say, the next point, you should remember that in 1919 Act, provinces were at the mercy of the center, right. Why? You can say because of those vague provisions. So, there was no real Swaraj, provinces were at the mercy of the center, but in 1935 Act, there was provincial autonomy, right. So, 1935 Act, you can use the word provincial autonomy. Then in 1919 Act, you must be knowing it, that diarchy, right, you can say, was important, right, you can say trick, important strategy in the provinces, and this disturbed the concept of Swaraj, diarchy. It was not the real Swaraj, diarchy was a biggest, you can say, problem in 1919 Act, right, but in 1935 Act, diarchy was abolished and it was introduced at the center. So, this right difference is also important. Then 1919 Act, there was no bicameralism in provinces, right, but in 1935 Act, bicameralism introduced in some states. So, we have to remember this difference also. Then 1919 Act extended the principle of communal representation by providing separate electorates for Sikh, Indian Christians, Anglo-Indians, Europeans, and 1935 Act further extended it by providing separate electorates for depressed classes, women and labor, right. Then one more, if you can add, that in 1919 Act there was no provision of what you call federal court, but in 1935 Act provided for, you can say, what, establishment of a federal court. So, these are, you can say, some important difference, right, 8-9 points we should remember, right. But what we have to remember, as I indicated in the background of these two acts, that these two acts should be conceived in the light of what? Responsible government, demand of representation, and as these two acts could not satisfy Indians, right, could not satisfy people of India, right, both the report and the act received universal condemnation, right, yet they were not devoid of utility and they played important role in the constitutional development of India, right. Thanks a lot.